Hi there, I'm Markaboy, and today I'm going to drop this big Douglas fir tree, and the first stage of cutting the tree down is to do a V-cut. That's the V-cut, and the idea is we're going to form a hinge, and the tree will fall perpendicular to the line of the hinge in here. Once I do the back cut, this tree is leaning heavily, and it'll fall along this as a fulcrum, as a hinge. Turns out that this tree is pretty rotten up the middle, and there's some rot around the side, so it wasn't long before nature would have brought the tree down in a good windstorm or something like that. Now that we've bucked up the lower part of this log, the butt end of the log, we've got to a point where the log is sound, nice tight rings, small knots, and we're going to buck it up into, in this case, into a 14-foot length before we start to mill it. The first stage of milling it up with the chainsaw using a fairly basic Alaska mill rig is you want to make sure your first cut is straight. So to do that, what I use is just a commoner garden plank. My plank happens to be 16 feet long. I could have a 14-foot plank or whatever works. Regular 2x6 plank, this one happens to be pressure treated, and I'm going to use 3-inch screws to fasten it to the top of the log. Now I check for alignments. What's important is to make sure that there's no twist in your plank and that the plank runs nice and flat. You don't want any dipsy doodles in your plank. So I just use my eyeball to straighten it up. You can use a string, you could use a laser, but it's all too complicated and time consuming. I'm at the narrower end of the log. This log's a pretty nice log. It's reasonably parallel, but as you can see, I can get my hand under the end of here, underneath the plank. So I could use all sorts of fancy gizmos. I'm just going to use a stick to support the end of the log here while I place the final screw. And it's not a permanent structure. As long as this plank stays true throughout the first cut, that's all we're interested in. The guide plank is firmly fixed to the top of the log now. One final check for alignment. And it looks pretty good. We're not making guitars here. This is raw lumber for construction purposes. Something to point out is that I always try to arrange my logs sloping downhill. Gravity is your friend when you're running an Alaska mill. The Alaska mill is a very simple rig in essence. The basic idea is that it clamps at each end of the saw bar, and there's an adjustable guide, horizontal guide for when you're sliding down the plank, the guide plank, which you'll see me using in a second. That it's much easier to, seeing is believing. Today I'm just going to be making my first cut at a 3.5-inch depth to make sure that I clear my 3-inch screws. Never operate a chainsaw without good hearing protection. we get to see what kind of a cut we've got underneath and the quality of the wood that's inside. I'm going to cut the rest of the log now into 1-inch planks. The first board will come off after the next cut, and then it'll be just zip, zip, zip all the way down the log. So we'll just refuel. It's preferable not to run out of gas when you're in mid-cut, but occasionally that happens. And I have found that it certainly extends the life of your bar to use the best quality chain bar oil that money can buy. It's very expensive, but it pays off in the end. Once the cut is established, I use my modified cycle inner tube to hold the throttle open. This allows me a more comfortable posture. It disconnects easily at the end of the run, or in case of emergency. This method works really well in remote locations where there aren't too many neighbors to annoy with the noise. It's not for in the city, absolutely not. Way too much noise, way too much mess. But in a situation like this where we have no roads, we have no electrical power, no transportation, we can take the chainsaw mill to the log because we're unable to take the logs to any mill. And there we have it. 8 really nice planks from that log. Total time to produce 2 to 3 hours. And once we've trimmed off the bark and straightened everything out, we'll have some really good wood here for a really nice floor.